When night falls and sound withdraws, the archive remains. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. A book rests on a wooden table. It is closed. Not as a decision renewed each moment, but as a state that persists because nothing interrupts it. The cover meets the page block along a seam thin enough to gather dust, thin enough to catch light for a moment, thin enough to suggest a boundary without allowing passage. The cover holds a faint grain beneath worn dye. The dye is not uniform. It is denser in the places that were handled, lighter along edges where contact thinned it over years. Fibers in the cover pressed together beneath the surface that has been warmed by hands and cooled by air repeatedly until the material stopped reacting in any visible way. Corners soften, not from a single strike, but from many small meetings with the world. Sleeve against corner, palm against edge, the slight drag of a book being moved a few centimeters, then placed back down. The table supports weight without sound. Wood receives mass and carries it downward into its legs, into the floor, into the larger structure beneath the room. The book does not sink. The table does not flex. The exchange occurs without announcement. The table itself carries a history of contact in its surface. Rings from vessels, faint scratches from objects dragged, a slight discoloration near one edge where light has fallen longest across the years. None of these marks speak. They are the accumulated record of pressure and exposure, held in the grain without intention. The book rests among these marks, adding its own small compression to the surface beneath it. Air moves across the upper plane of the cover and continues on. The air is not strong enough to lift a page, even if a page were available to lift. The book is closed. There is no gap for air to enter. The room's currents pass overhead like weather passing over a sealed surface. The air above the table is not still in the absolute sense. Thermal currents shift as the room adjusts to its own temperature variations. Warmer near a wall that faces outside, cooler near the floor. These currents are too gentle to be felt on skin. They are only visible when dust moves slightly, tracing the current's paths before settling again. The book does not respond to any of it. Its mass is too great relative to the force passing over it. Light settles at an angle. A thin line gathers where cover meets page, a narrow brightness along the seam, then a gradual fading into shadow. Dust rests in that crease. Dust is not decorative. It is the physical evidence of time moving in small increments. Particles descending, contacting, stopping. A layer forms not because anything is added deliberately, but because gravity is constant. The dust along the seam is older than the dust on the upper plane. The upper surface is disturbed occasionally. A hand reaches past. Air moves with more force. The table is wiped. But the seam is narrow and low and protected by the geometry of two surfaces meeting. What settles there settles without disturbance. The crease accumulates slowly, grain by grain, and the record persists. The spine curves slightly, a shape produced by construction and held by balanced tension. Within, folded sheets align in signatures. Thread passes through them in measured intervals. The thread is hidden by the paper it binds. It does not declare itself a structure. It becomes structure by disappearing. Humidity in the room shifts by a fraction. Fibers in paper take in moisture, swelling along their grain. Expansion follows structure. Contraction follows structure back. These changes are too small to see from a distance, but they occur. The book remains closed while the materials inside breathe by chemistry rather than by choice. The swelling is not uniform across the page block. Fibers run in a direction determined by how the paper was made. Expansion follows that direction preferentially. The page block widens more in one axis than the other. The cover, made of different material, responds differently to the same humidity. The cover and the pages move by different amounts, in different directions, at different rates. They press against each other with slightly different force as conditions change. The book holds together because the difference is small and the structure is built to accommodate it. The book contains words. The words remain enclosed. Not in a vault, not in a secret, simply within surfaces pressed together under steady pressure. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The sentence rests on the cover without imprint. The die does not take it in. The fibers do not rearrange to hold it. It remains external, like light that touches a surface and leaves no mark. Inside the closed form, pages press against pages. The contact is continuous. There is no friction because there is no movement. The only forces are weight and compression, distributed across thousands of sheets as a uniform, quiet load. The page edges form a pale block when seen from the side. It looks smooth at distance, but the smoothness is an illusion made from irregularity. Each page is cut at a slightly different micro-angle. Each fiber protrudes in a different place. The edge is a landscape too small to see without magnification. What appears straight is an agreement made of unevenness. This edge is also where the book is most vulnerable to moisture and handling. The cut fibers at the edge absorb humidity faster than the surface of the page. When the air is damp, the edges expand first. A book that has been handled for many years in a humid climate will develop a slight waviness at its edges. Not because the pages have been damaged, but because the fibers at the cut surface have expanded and contracted many times. The book holds this history as shape. Between the cover and the first page, pressure is light but constant. No air passes between, yet air exists everywhere around the book, and the absence of air in that seam becomes noticeable only because air is present everywhere else. The closed state is defined by contact, cover to paper, paper to paper, surface to surface, held there by the simple fact that nothing has intervened. Binding is not a line, it is a system. Sheets are folded, gathered, aligned. Thread passes through, returns, passes again. Each stitch enters and exits as a repeated action that becomes invisible once finished. The fold holds because tension is distributed along many points. If one stitch were isolated, it could fail. Because stitches share tension, the system holds. The thread is not the only element of the binding. Adhesive may coat the spine, filling the gaps between signatures, creating a continuous layer that reinforces the thread's work. The adhesive is flexible when it cures, not rigid, because rigidity would crack when the book is opened. The adhesive moves with the book, absorbing the stress of opening and closing across many repetitions without separating. At rest, it contributes to the hold. In use, it yields enough to allow motion. Now at rest, it simply holds. Where a needle moved, fibers separated briefly. They opened. Then they closed around thread. The opening did not remain open. Paper does not keep a wound the way skin does. It keeps an alignment. Fibers settle around the new occupation and accept it as structure. The whole becomes part of the paper's geometry, not a disruption of it. The spine holds its curve because stress is balanced. Not perfectly, not mathematically, but sufficiently. Balance persists because no single area is asked to carry more than its share. The book remains closed because the binding holds the pages in a compressed, aligned stack, resisting the tendency of paper to spring outward at edges. Paper has memory. A page that has been folded wants to return to flat. A page that has been curved wants to return to curved. The pages in this book have been in their current configuration long enough that their memory is of this arrangement. They do not press against the binding trying to unfold. Their tension and the binding's tension have reached an agreement. The book holds its shape because the materials inside have come to want the shape they are in. If the room cools, the glue stiffens slightly. If the room warms, it softens slightly. These shifts are minute, but they change the way the cover presses against the page block. The change does not open the book. It only alters pressure by a fraction, like the difference between one hand resting and the same hand relaxing by a degree. The table beneath absorbs a trace of vibration from distant movement. Something closes elsewhere. A structure settles. A footstep touches another floor. Vibrations move through the building, but by the time they reach the table, they are already diminished. The book receives almost nothing of them. The thread inside does not transmit them as motion. The pages do not separate to respond. The structure is built to hold. Breath enters. Breath leaves. The book remains closed. Ink rests within the grain of paper. It does not sit on top like paint. It entered while wet, moved along capillary paths, and stopped when the fibers held no more. The boundary of each mark is not a strict edge. It is a gradient of saturation at the scale of cellulose. At distance, a line appears sharp. Up close, a line becomes a field. Dense in the center, lighter at the edge, uneven where fibers drank differently. Ink does not shine. It absorbs light. Where ink lies, the surface darkens and becomes quieter visually, as if light is being taken rather than returned. Where ink does not lie, paper remains exposed, pale, slightly textured. Between strokes, intervals separate forms. The intervals are not emptiness. They are structure. Without spacing, marks would collapse into one another. With spacing, marks remain distinct. The book contains language as arrangement, not as voice. The characters do not sound because no air is being pushed through them. The sentences do not unfold because no eye is moving across them. Meaning is not active. It is not circulating. It is not performing. It remains latent within fixed form. A margin surrounds each block of text. White space frames density. The margin is the place where nothing is printed, and because nothing is printed there, the printed area becomes visible as printed. The margin holds the text in place by defining what it is not. It is not decoration, it is boundary. Within the closed book, this boundary persists without being used. The white space does not brighten. The ink does not fade. The words do not become more meaningful by being ignored. They remain exactly as they were when they dried. Pressure from the cover presses gently against the first page. Ink does not transfer. No imprint migrates. The paper fibers do not accept pigment from a neighboring sheet because the pigment is already fixed. Dryness is a kind of finality at the molecular scale. The ink has bonded where it bonded. It will not travel without solvent, without abrasion, without force beyond what is present here. Humidity shifts again by a narrow degree. Paper fibers adjust, swelling slightly, relaxing slightly. The ink does not expand with them. It remains bound to the fibers it entered. The page may change dimension by a fraction, but the relationships between marks remain stable because they are embedded rather than sitting on a surface. No character advances beyond its margin. No stroke crosses its boundary. Not because it chooses restraint, but because it is fixed. The book contains motion only as history. The motion of a hand that wrote, the motion of liquid that spread, the motion of drying that stopped it. Those motions are no longer present. Only a result remains. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them. The sentence descends toward the hidden page and touches the surface lightly, like dust touches surfaces, like light touches surfaces. It does not enter. Ink does not absorb it. Paper does not alter. The line remains external because closed structure does not admit meaning by proximity alone. Night advances gradually. Light thins across the table. The upper plane of the cover becomes less legible as contrast lowers. Grain merges into tone. Corners soften further, not by changing shape, but by losing definition in dimness. As light decreases, the book loses its surface detail in sequence. First, the fine grain disappears into even tone. Then the tonal variation across the cover, lighter at the center, darker at corners, flattens until the cover reads as a single shade. Then the distinction between cover and table becomes harder to trace. The boundary that was clear at noon becomes a suggestion, then a proximity, then a region without a precise edge. The book remains closed while the room changes around it. Temperature drifts downward by small degrees. Air becomes slightly denser with coolness. Humidity equalizes across surfaces. The cover cools. The table cools. The difference between materials becomes less dramatic when all surfaces approach the same temperature. Different materials cool at different rates. The metal clasp of a different book nearby cools faster than the wood of the table, which cools faster than the thick cover of this book. For a time in the early evening, each surface in the room is at a slightly different temperature. Running a hand across them will reveal these differences as variations in the sensation of warmth. As the night deepens, these differences narrow. The room approaches a common temperature, and the surfaces that were distinct in their warmth become indistinguishable. Dust remains where it fell. No disturbance arrives to rearrange it. The seam between cover and pages becomes a line of shadow rather than a line of light. The place where surfaces meet becomes harder to see, not because it has opened, but because light is no longer separating it. Inside, thread continues to hold the fold. The binding persists as tension distributed across many points. Each stitch holds because other stitches hold. The spine holds its curve because forces balance. Nothing tightens, nothing loosens. The system remains in equilibrium. The pages remain pressed together. Contact continues. No air enters between sheets. The absence of airflow inside the book is part of its closedness. No flutter, no movement, no sound. The only movement is molecular, too small and too slow to register as event. At the molecular level, the fibers of every page are in constant small motion, thermal vibration that increases with temperature and slows as temperature falls. As the room cools to night, this motion slows. The molecules in the paper press together with slightly less urgency. The pages become, in the most technical sense, slightly more still. Nothing about the book changes that could be observed, but the system moves toward a lower energy state with the cooling room, drawn downward by the night. Breath enters, breath leaves. Ink remains where it entered the grain. The boundaries remain. The margins remain. The language remains unactivated, not withheld, simply unused. The book does not conceal knowledge as an act. It merely does not present it. Closeness is not secrecy. It is latency. The latency is not diminished by the darkness. What the book contains is not reduced because it cannot be seen. The arrangement of marks on each page is as complete at midnight as at noon. The relationships between characters are unchanged. The structure of the language is intact. The book is the same book in darkness that it was in light. The difference is only in what the darkness permits to be perceived. The space around the book feels wider as attention loosens. Edges lose precision. The table becomes less of an object and more of a plane. The book becomes less of a shape and more of a mass within a darker field. When contrast lowers enough, the mind stops tracing outlines. Outlines dissolve into the room. The dissolution is not a change in the book. It is a change in the relationship between the book and available light. The book's form is complete in the dark. Its cover still meets the page block at the seam. Its corners still hold their softened shape. Its spine still curves. None of this is lost. Only the report reaching the observer has changed. Silence continues, not as emptiness, but as the stable condition produced when nothing demands separation. The book remains closed. Cover against page, page against page, ink within fiber, thread within fold. The room continues to cool. Dust rests in the seam. The table holds its weight without sound. Nothing begins. Nothing concludes. The closed book is the structure of contact held in equilibrium. By thread, by pressure, by the memory of paper settled into its shape over time. What it contains, it will continue to contain. What it holds not by effort, but by the absence of a reason to release. True wisdom cannot be captured in words. It is found only in the silence between them.